I see you took a seat. You look comfortable. By all means, don't let social norms get in the way of your needs. I also see here that you have alateral cochlear sensitivity. So I can help accommodate for that by just shifting my voice from ear to ear so as not to overload either one of your aural channels. It's almost quite literally the least I can do. Tick, tick. Depression. You're depressed. You have my commiserations. Given that state of affairs, I hope you'll allow me a brief preamble to the meat of our appointment. Consider, feel it pertinent to the circumstances at hand. A word about evolution. Evolution via natural selection has a goal, as I'm sure you're aware: perpetuate the existence of the species. And yet, in humanity's case alone, evolution has gone too far, and it's slowly twisting us into beings who can sense the absurdity of their own existence, thus calling into question the typically assumed notion that we are the apotheosis of life through many millennia of winnowing, competition, etc. In reality, we're probably more like the babirusa, whose massive teeth initially assured dominance, but now run the risk of growing right through the frontal bone of their own skulls, hoisted by their own petard, impaled by their own success. In that way, they're not unlike myself, personally. I make a medical breakthrough, possibly one that could save thousands of lives, and I'm rewarded by having my license suspended. Seems fair. At least the babirusa was spared the knowledge of the lunacy behind the motivations, if you can even call them that, of its own demise. One could spend all day debating the relative merits of natural selection versus a board of dim-witted pedagogues. One might also spend a whole day counting dead leaves, and either one of those exercises would be of equal value. But if we return to this possibly apocryphal babirusa analogy, if we were to lay the blame at the feet of one attribute, then I think the equivalent of uncontrolled dental growth in humans is very likely to be the development of language. Language has provided a means by which human beings can, at their own peril, drill deeper into their existential nature than any other living creature that we know of, at least. It seems like a great idea. If you'll allow me to take your temperature. Doing well. Anyway, on the surface, seems like a great idea, right? What could go wrong? And yet, as we plumb the depths and mysteries of the universe with that intellect, with that language, we do not become happier creatures. On the contrary, we become, on the whole, more disgruntled, disgusted, terrified, paradoxically bored, disappointed, anxiety-ridden, and depressed. Why? Maybe it's because the universe isn't actually the wondrous place it presents itself as on the surface to our senses. It is just beneath this facade, rife with horrors. If we seek bliss, we might be well advised to pursue anything but enlightenment. We should instead allow the universe to appear to us as it wishes to appear, as indeed it appears to all but this outlier species of monkey who thinks it knows better. And yet we're, by our nature, very curious. Who wants bliss? Or rather, who wants bliss at the cost of resisting turning over rocks or biting the apple? See how well that turned out for Eve, for the Cyclops, for Lot, Prometheus, that weird-faced Nazi dude in Indiana Jones. They had the nerve to say I wasn't following proper protocol, that I was reckless, and that my bedside manner was atrocious. Fools, leaf counters. My advice to anyone drawing breath: tread gently. Exist in the blanketing comfort of night. Do not look beyond the borders of your small corner of what the universe presents to your senses. We don't need to literally be living batteries feeding some arcane and slightly ridiculous alien machinery to take the Wachowski blue pill. The actual truth may be far more banal to your average 14-year-old, but it's still plenty horrifying. And before you get worried, I got my license back, obviously. It's here. It did require a fair amount of back-channel dealings, which only reinforced my rather negative opinion of the medical community, but there you have it. All right. I've looked at the top page of your file. I'm going to go a little deeper. Mm. Mm. A moment. Okay. I've analyzed you closely enough now that I've arrived at a diagnosis, your results, and I have to warn you, they aren't good, so steel yourself. You are dying. And yet, this is not the end of the world, although it is the end of your world. You see, we are, every one of us, dreadfully and terminally sick. Humans have existed for 200,000 years. Think about that. And across all that time, we're no closer to figuring out anything meaningful about existence than we were at the dawn of the species. From a hypothetical outsider's perspective, this would be incredibly perplexing. So we ask, why is the process of living so difficult? Why does humanity suffer so many problems, dilemmas, easily preventable catastrophes every day of our lives, as if we're just stumbling upon them for the very first time in history? Yes, it's true, there has been progress in some areas, most obviously medicine. But when we turn our attention to the black dog nipping at our heels, in the grand scheme of things, there's been virtually none. One might even argue that things have degraded over time. It just feels like we should have made more progress by now. It's not like we haven't been given ample opportunity. 20,000, well over 20,000 generations of humans have plotted the planet Earth. And each one of them ultimately frittered their life away. Didn't contribute anything towards calming the existential fear holding sway over any one of us. It's as if the clock resets with every new generation. Even though there's no such clock, there's no such line of demarcation, there is no defined terminus, the line is unbroken. Generations are staggered, so there's no excuse. People and institutions contain the knowledge of the ancients. We should be standing on the shoulders of giants. Instead, we flop like fish at their feet, begging to be trod upon. So what prevents wisdom in this extremely particular, exacting, and of ultimate importance, the realm of ultimate importance, knowledge? What prevents knowledge from accumulating in that field across the whole of history? Why is so much being figured out anew during any given being's lifetime? It's a puzzle. I mean, admittedly, right? The difficulty of human life more than a few thousand years ago precluded a lot of philosophical thought, as these poor sods concentrated on not falling victim to apex predators. But it would be presumptuous to rule it out. It makes sense to think that more than a few hunter-gatherer types had moments of ennui, self-reflection, and maybe a rarefied few had prescience far beyond their phylogenic years. So again, what has propagated this disease? Could you just open your mouth for a moment? Say, ah. God, don't even need a light. Your tonsils are coated in fungus. Okay. When you drink water, you must feel Christ-like. You turn water into a thick marsala. Pardon the imagery, maybe. Bedside manner. Okay. Maybe I get it. But imagine, if you will, this horrifying scenario. Because you're depressed. And what better way to help you than to imagine horrifying scenarios? But let's do it anyway. There was a single point in time at which there was a single human being, and this poor creature was the first to have an understanding of their own mortality. Imagine how that person must have felt. We can assume, I believe rightly so, that this occurred far before language had evolved, certainly before it had evolved to a sufficient point to be able to express things like despair, a despair that was likely only compounded by this person's inability to express or discuss it. They couldn't find sympathy or commiseration amongst their contemporaries. I mean, you're dying, but at least we can talk about it, right? And while medicine has made countless advances, guess what? The world death rate still holds steady at 100%. So ask yourself, what real impact has there been? I don't know about you, but I tend to think about things analytically anyway, in words. I can sense them running through my brain. They seem inextricably tied to their corresponding thoughts, and at times it can feel like I'm having a dialogue with myself. But insight from analysis, that supersedes words. Those eureka moments have little to do with language. And I don't know how important this is. Certainly, people's thoughts aren't limited by their ability to express them. After all, language is a construct meant to make it possible to express yourself to others, not one meant to express yourself to yourself. That very act belies the word express. The opposite of express is suppress. But when we suppress something, we're very rarely suppressing it from ourselves. Typically, we're suppressing it from the outsider. So you think you have it bad now? How do you think you'd fare if you had been that lucky, enlightened person looking around at your fellow tribespeople with this inexpressible sadness, being alone in the knowledge that each one of them would die, utterly alone with this terrible truth? Your compatriots proceeded along their fragile lives, blissfully unaware of their fate. Yes, I mean, they ran from predators. They avoided pain. They didn't stick their hand in the fire twice. But these were instinctual actions. These were pre-programmed responses. This is natural selection breeding them to avoid danger. This was not an intellectual consideration of their predicament. This was a predicament foisted upon them by their progenitors, who themselves likely did not realize the pleasure they pursued and the pain they issued would result in perpetuating the existence of their own species. They were just made that way. They weren't aware of it. So for complete clarity, and to sound a little bit like a politician, let me reiterate. There was a point in history where the following things were true. A single human being thought about death intellectually had no way to share this knowledge with his or her companions. There was, at one time, the very first existential crisis. There was the very first depressive. And I'm sure not long after that, there was the first despair-induced suicide. Soon after this, probably, there was the first suicide note, although bereft of language as we know it, these early remnants of life likely took the form of symbolic mementos, cards, careful placement of personal possessions, or other illustrative last words, things that predated traditional writing. Now that is scary, but more frightening to me is the follow-up question we can't answer, and that is, how often did this damning eureka moment strike our forebears? Because for centuries, this would have happened spontaneously. Each instance arrived at independently of any outside influence. Each one a terrible realization spawned only by the events that made up an individual's ontological experience. And each one of these brilliant horrors had no way by which to propagate, and so each was snuffed out, or maybe contained is a better word, within the confines of the fragile life of their respective thinkers, just as eventually the entirety of humanity will blink out one way or another into nothing. Our species as a whole is only hardier than a single life when measured with trivially terrestrial intervals of time. On a cosmic scale, we're as good as gone already. And then, another eureka moment. Another monolith landed. And this one was self-propagating. And now, of course, I'm talking about humanity discovering language and the ability to express complex thoughts and ideas. Suddenly, and in the cosmic scale of time, it was very suddenly, concepts could exist beyond the scope of an individual's life. Ideas could be shared, passed down. And as we mentioned earlier, on the surface, this seems like an immeasurable boon, because everything learned in one life could be used to inform the next. Surely with all the combined knowledge, all of humanity piling up as we each learned things and contributed to this institutional wealth of knowledge, we would, in fairly short order, find better ways to live. And the life of one born further along the linear progression of humanity's phylogeny would have to suffer none of the fits and starts of earlier generations, because they received a copy of the test before having to take it. And again, though, by and large, antibiotics, modern dentistry notwithstanding, this just was not the case. Language was not the panacea it appeared to be. Humanity fell well short of the Pierian spring. In many instances, language was a destructive force. With the proliferation of language, the virus, the meme of despair, could spread to those who might not have otherwise stumbled upon this morbid discovery on their own. Left to their own devices, maybe never would have found out about it. But now, human beings were able to teach their offspring of the horrors the world pushed upon them. Old age, the inevitability of illness, decrepitude, death. Although they did not and still do not have any insight into why it is so, and no hope of changing the outcome. 20,000 generations, more than 20,000 generations, have attempted to puzzle this out. The hips of human females widened to accompany brains bloated to futilely ponder matters they could have no effect upon. Matters which knowledge of in the end only brought unhappiness, depression. Ignorance is bliss. I don't find that to be a trite axiom. I would argue it's the hallmark of the human species. A little learning is a dangerous thing, but judging from this Earth experiment, it would appear that a lot of learning is no better. Philosophical mental gymnastics work only while aloft on the philosophical pommel horse. They do not meaningfully affect the universe they strive to make sense of. Well, let's be fair. If we're to vilify language, let's make sure we're at least as precise as we can be. Ignorance is bliss. That implies the state of being ignorant creates bliss without any sort of reciprocity. So, phrased in that way, ignorance is merely implied to be one of the many methods by which an individual achieves bliss. But I would argue that bliss is only attainable via ignorance. And so, inverting the axiom is the more accurate of the two orders. Bliss is ignorance. Now, that concisely captures the notion that any time you feel yourself in a state of bliss, it's only because there is something vile and horrifying which you do not know. And that, quite naturally, calls into question the value of even trying. It's painful. If you're tied fast to the tracks and you hear the whistle of an approaching locomotive, what poorer use of your time could there be than the study of trains? Wouldn't this make your remaining time all the more horrifying? Real life lacks the contrivances and the extraordinary coincidences found in scripted narratives. If life were a movie, the knowledge of a thing would ultimately give you some insight into how you could stop it. For a train, there might be a lever you could jostle with your foot, diverting the train onto another track, sparing yourself at the last possible moment, rejoicing in your newfound appreciation of this reclaimed vital gift. In real life, though, there is no respite. There is no last-minute saving grace. And if the train and its course cannot be altered, why bother considering it? You'd be better off observing the wildflowers springing up between the railroad ties, just pushing all thoughts of the train out of your mind, suppressing your own knowledge. For some people, this isn't an issue. They're looking at the flowers anyway. It's their default position. But for those who cannot but think of the oncoming train, it takes a lot more effort to appreciate the flowers. And yet, who's to say who is the more insightful hostage? The one who must, through forcefulness of will, divert their attention from the train, or the one who never considered the train in the first place? What a lucky bastard. And what does this say about those who cannot give the flowers even a moment's thought. They're obsessed with the oncoming train, and they will be until they make first contact with the cattle catcher. They spend their time thinking about all the glittering tricks they pull off on the pommel horse, thinking these tricks have some real-world application, that these exercises in futility are of some actual practical use, which they're not. These are also leaf counters. Know your enemy. It's only useful if that knowledge confers an advantage over said enemy. We can't overcome this enemy. Knowledge is useless. Yet some wouldn't have it any other way. These are the devoted ferroequinologists. They want to know how fast the train is going, how wide the rails are, of what horsepower is the locomotive. Is it steam or diesel? How many cars does it carry? What is the cargo? Etc. None of this knowledge has any effect on their imminent, immutable, and very brief relationship with the train itself. Nothing, including any information gleaned, will alter the course of the train or their position on the track. The wildflowers beckon, but the inhaled pollen generates no histamine, no response at all. These people will not consider the lily. They will not notice the sick rose. That reminds me, yesterday, I was reading The Sick Rose in a proper reading chair. My legs were crossed because I'm not an animal, and in the course of switching which hand was holding the book, my right hand came down quite naturally, heel of my palm first, and hit the lower part of my left shin, my left leg being crossed over my right. I believe it was a tibia that was impacted. I'm a doctor, but I couldn't say with complete certainty because that wasn't what I was thinking about at the time. What I was certain about was the sensation that ensued. It sounded as if two solid, if thin, pieces of wood had been clacked together. It felt like my left leg was no more than a hollow piece of bamboo, long dried in the sun. The impact reverberated up my leg almost to the knee. The leg thrummed like the end of a diving board, whose diver still hung in midair, yet to break the surface of the water. The sensation was so peculiar that I slammed my palm into my leg again to recreate it, and the effect was easy enough to reproduce. But this sensation, very unnerving. What it did was it momentarily disconnected me from my body. It made me starkly, albeit transiently, aware of the ridiculousness of this contraption we almost universally accept as our physical self. So why am I telling you this? What makes it notable? I believe it's important to have these type of revelations from time to time. These bits of fabric frayed. if just to remind ourselves of two things. One, we are not luminous beings. If anything, we're ludicrous beings. And two, when presented with any reality for a sufficiently long time, we will come to accept it as natural and normal, and eventually find it impossible to imagine reality existing any other way. And it's the second realization that's of lasting importance, because it all but assures the subsequent thought that the way things are is the way things are supposed to be. And if things are the way they're supposed to be, then having them any other way represents divergence from a plan. And there you are. Once the idea of a plan is in place, religion and the self, two very, very dangerous ideas that spoil countless lives, if indeed any life can be spoiled. They become fait accompli. We cannot take the current state of affairs, such as it is, as any indication of a plan, because we were presented with things in this state, and we would acclimate to any state that allowed our survival, and if the state did not allow our survival, we would not be here to acclimate. Hindsight is horribly dangerous. We excel at finding patterns, often where none exist. So jar yourself from your rut for a moment. Think about the predicament all human life finds itself in. We all share a common origin, common terminus. We are almost all aware of this fact. And while we can do some small things to prolong our tenure, by and large, we careen through life with no control until we slam into the invisible wall, or in your case, it slams into you. You might actually take some comfort in not being alone in this regard. The specifics change over time. It may be a trend that we are getting longer and longer average lifespans, but it's foolhardy to think that just because a thing has been going one way for a while, that it doesn't have the capability to reverse. We are very poor stewards of history, and our data set is extremely small. It's not out of the question that at some point in the future we'll have shorter lives. And with that being the case, we'll adjust. Our teeth pierce our own brains. That reality becomes normal. We acclimate. As long as we live long enough to reproduce, we'll continue to exist. And this unwitting frog boiling can be facilitated by an unfortunate tendency to cling to the idea of the self, of individuality. There's a notion of generational amnesia, which is also dangerous in the way it insidiously inserts itself into our perception of normality. If, a mass extinction event wants to sneak up on humanity unaware, its best tactic would be to do so slowly, take climate change as an oft-cited example. Each generation of climate scientists is handed the present state of events as their baseline, and that becomes the yardstick by which they measure their own impact on the direction of a given foreboding variable. Of course, the data exists showing trends beyond their personal stewardship. But as we cannot do anything about what happened before we were alive, the tendency is to focus on what you can change. It's almost easy to dismiss events before your life as less relevant or real. You are now. Focus on now. It's going to get us into horrible trouble. Right now, there are about 7.7 deaths per year per 1,000 people. This is global. It doesn't take predisposing factors into account, but we could say with reasonable assurance that if you have some contact, physical or via media, internet, whatever, with say 50 people a day, and I'm including, television personalities, that of those encounters you have in a given week, 2 of those human beings will be dead within a year. Joy. Are you any better off for knowing that fact? Did it in any way comfort you? And the larger question, has there been any knowledge you can remember that has comforted you that was not itself simply nullifying earlier knowledge that caused that discomfort? I'll give you an example. It doesn't do any good to say, I feel better knowing that I came from nothing and I'm going to return to nothing, and therefore there is no net loss. Because this thought only follows once you have learned that you came from nothing and will return to nothing. Epicurus said fear of death was the most absurd fear there was, because while one fears death, it is not, and when death is, we are not. Paraphrasing there. So is everyone else. But I think this aphorism completely misses the point. Agony requires existence. Death negates it. If we could exist within death, we wouldn't fear it so. Who is so ignorant as to not fear the single largest state change that's possible? The single largest state change that a living being can undergo. People are afraid of moving. People are afraid of leaving their house at a time different than their normal time. They're afraid of missing a deadline. They're not afraid of death. There's another argument that goes along the lines of, if you cut my tongue out, my pain is no less for not being able to verbalize it, but this is a performative and easily deflected strike, because physical pain is not in any way related to existential pain. And there are people who so fear death that they actually hope to endure excruciating pain before they die. So in that moment, the only moment that matters, in that moment, death is the better of the two options, and they will run to it, arms open, their fear shedded. Because physical pain to them is, to all of us, is a known entity. Its extents are understood better than what happens at the moment of death. Even if you have never been in excruciating pain in your life, you can extrapolate better than you can extrapolate about the knowledge of death. Death is shrouded completely in its trademark black cloak. There's nothing even there for us to comprehend. All experience ceases at the threshold. Instead of asking what happens when an immutable force meets an immovable object, one might be better served to ask if death, Babirusa-like, can impale himself on his own scythe. When the curtains part, we're all given, in the grand scheme of things, a similar window into the living world before the curtains close, which they only do once and irrevocably. Unless you get, paddled back into existence. So, what we do during this brief flicker of time when the spotlight shines can be distilled down to really just two paths that make all the difference in the way you experience your strutting and your fretting. This is, of course, assuming you have some control over which path you walk, that some agency exists to choose. Let's just say that you do. The first path is to spend your time, and almost all your time, because it's very difficult to be a weekend warrior with this type of thing, considering your own end. And the second path is to spend your time reveling in the time itself. Consider it magical. It doesn't matter if you believe in magic. Just consider it magical by virtue of its inability to be understood. Come to grips with the fact that you have no way of knowing if purpose exists, and whether it does or not, you die either way, and any lingering change you may think you have made will eventually fade away. This is true. It doesn't matter if you wrote Hey Jude, or the second law of thermodynamics. All of that may as well snuff it with you, because it doesn't matter if your echo lingers for 75 years or 75,000 years. Those numbers are both equal in the eyes of the infinite, which is to say they're both worth nothing. And there's no way around it. Existence is masturbatory. We create to enjoy. We enjoy to create. We exist until we don't. And any lasting impression we make is only significant when we consider it relative to lesser impressions. All knowledge possessed by the greatest human to exist, and all benefits that human, future or past, may have or will have bestowed or had bestowed upon humanity, all of that will cinder with the sun. None of it will have made any difference. And the joy is meaningless. But that's not the important bit. The truly important bit is that the suffering is unnecessary. So maintain radio silence. You're dying. It doesn't matter. Knowledge is useless. Language perpetuates horror. The wildflowers beckon. Sleep as best you can, as long as you can. And for God's sake, stop talking so much. Christ, you never shut up. Constant interruptions. Really, they complain about my bedside manner. Imagine having to uphold a professional demeanor in the face of this constant yammering. Unbelievable. All right. That'll be $498.34.